Why do we love billionaire superheroes? Now, stop me if you've heard this one. A billionaire inherits a massive fortune, uses it to build military-grade weapons in secret, and then operates completely outside the law to beat up poor people in bad neighborhoods. In real life, that's a villain. In a movie, that's Batman. Welcome, my friends, to the Batman paradox. It's this weird thing where we generally agree that billionaires shouldn't run the world, yet we flock to theaters to watch fictional billionaires do exactly that. Why do we do that? Well, because democracy is boring. It's slow. It's full of meetings. But a billionaire in a flying suit? Well, that's efficient. We love these characters because they represent the benevolent dictator fantasy. The idea that if we just found the right rich guy, he could fix everything without all that annoying voting and due process getting in the way. But here is the danger. When we constantly watch movies where the government is useless and only the rich guy can save us, we start to believe it. We start to think taxation is theft and philanthropy is the only way to solve problems. We start waiting for a savior instead of fixing the system ourselves. Welcome, my friends, to a new English Plus podcast episode, and this one is taken from English Plus magazine. I wrote a massive deep dive on this, talking about the charity trap, the architecture of intimidation, and the vocabulary of power. Now, of course, you can read the article. It's got puzzles, quizzes, and a lot more to chew on. What I'm going to share with you today is the article itself, the focus on language, and the critical thinking bit. But that's definitely not everything you're going to find on the website. I'm going to leave you a link in the description so you can go and enjoy not only this article, but a lot of articles that I'm going to publish on this specific topic, not the Batman paradox only. This is just one of it. Our current theme is corruption and oligarchy. And believe me, this is not about politics. This is about us. But the more important thing, this is about language as well. Because this is English Plus podcast, so we're not just going to talk about this. We're going to learn some interesting words that we can use in our everyday language in our Focus on Language section. I'm going to try to do more of these English Plus magazine episodes. But of course, I won't have time to record all of them, so you can always go to the website and read the other articles. Now, before we start with today's episode, just let me tell you about the new format of the articles. From now on, we always have an article, which is usually a thought-provoking piece, and then we have focus on language. We focus on some of the words that we used in context and how we can use them in our everyday language, and then we flip the script a little bit and we put on our critical thinking caps. We challenge the very things we just talked about. And you're going to see that in this episode. But of course, that's not everything. There's also activities, vocabulary builders, crossword puzzles, and other activities that you will find on the website. And there's also a unique interview with someone from history who is related to the topic we're talking about. And of course, I do this to shed a different light on the topic and show different perspectives as well. And now, my friends, without further ado, let's start with the Batman paradox. I'm Danny, and this is a new episode from English Plus Podcast. There is a strange cognitive dissonance that happens when we walk into a movie theater. Outside, on the sidewalk, we might be the kind of people who complain about wealth inequality. We might look at the skyrocketing net worth of tech moguls and wonder why one person needs enough money to buy a small country while the rest of us are budgeting for groceries. We might even nod along to arguments that billionaires shouldn't exist, that no one earns $1 billion without exploiting someone or breaking something. Then we buy our ticket, grab our popcorn, and sit in the dark for 2 hours to cheer for a billionaire who uses his massive inherited fortune to beat up poor people. This is the Batman paradox. And it's not just Batman. It's Iron Man, it's Green Arrow, it's a whole pantheon of fictional heroes who are essentially oligarchs. They are wealthy elites who operate completely outside the law, using private technology and military grade weaponry to enforce their personal version of justice. In the real world, if a CEO built a fusion reactor in his basement and started flying around shooting lasers at criminals without a warrant, we would call him a dangerous warlord. In fiction, we call him a superhero. Why is this archetype so appealing? Why do we protest against the 1% in the streets but idolize them on the screen? It isn't just about cool gadgets or explosions. It goes much deeper, tapping into our anxieties about democracy, our frustration with bureaucracy, and a lingering, dangerous fantasy about the benevolent dictator. So let's start with the benevolent dictator fantasy. Well, let's face it, my friends, democracy is hard. It is messy, slow, and often incredibly boring. It involves committees, town halls, compromises, and the frustrating reality that you rarely get exactly what you want. Democracy requires us to accept that change takes time and that institutions, no matter how flawed, are the only way to govern a complex society fairly. But the human brain, our own brain, doesn't really like slow and complex. We like fast and decisive. And here comes the myth of competence. This is where the billionaire superhero comes in. They represent the ultimate fantasy of competence. Bruce Wayne doesn't have to wait for a city council vote to fix the Batmobile. Tony Stark doesn't need to file an environmental impact statement before building a new suit. They just do it. They have the resources to bypass the gridlock of society and the will to act immediately. We find this incredibly soothing. In a world where we feel powerless against massive systemic issues like climate change, crime, corruption, the idea of a single, hyper-competent individual who can fix everything with a checkbook and a punch is intoxicating. It relieves us of the burden of collective action. We don't have to organize, vote, or protest if we wait for the guy in the cape to save us. Well, this is the core of the benevolent dictator myth. The belief that autocracy isn't bad in itself, it's just that we haven't found the right autocrat yet. We tell ourselves that if we had that kind of money and power, we would use it for good. We would be the good billionaire. And so, we project that fantasy onto these characters. We ignore the fact that, in reality, absolute power rarely creates benevolence. It usually creates tyranny. But in the safe confines of a comic book movie, we are allowed to indulge in the wish that a king, a good, kind, violent king, will come clean up the mess. Well, there's a psychological comfort in outsourcing our agency. When we watch these movies, we aren't identifying with the citizens of Gotham who are terrified and helpless. We are identifying with the savior. But the narrative structure actually reinforces our helplessness. The police can't stop the Joker. The mayor can't stop the Joker. The voters certainly can't stop the Joker. Only the billionaire can. Well, this creates a subtle cultural conditioning. It suggests that regular people are incapable of solving big problems. It implies that solutions must come from above, from the exceptional few who have the resources and the intellect to guide the sheep. It is a profoundly anti-democratic message wrapped in a shiny, entertaining package. It tells us that our role is to be rescued, not to be the rescuers. And this is a very dangerous idea indeed. Now let's talk about philanthropy versus taxation. Now, if you look closely at the economics of superhero universes, you start to see a very specific political worldview. In these stories, money is a superpower, but only when it is spent voluntarily. Bruce Wayne is often shown attending galas, writing massive checks to orphanages, and funding hospitals. Tony Stark funds scholarships. This is framed as the ultimate moral good. And don't get me wrong, charity is great. But in the context of these stories, Philanthropy is presented as a superior alternative to systemic change. The message is clear. The rich should help people, but they should do it on their own terms, at their own discretion. It validates the idea of noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility to be generous to the peasants. This is a feudal concept, not a democratic one. In a democracy, we ostensibly believe that resources should be distributed through taxation and public spending decided upon by the people. But in superhero movies, taxation is almost never mentioned, and when the government tries to get involved with the hero's money or tech, it is depicted as theft or overreach. Remember in Iron Man 2 when the US government wants Stark's tech? The government is the villain. Stark, the private individual with a weapon of mass destruction, is the hero for refusing to hand it over. And here let's talk more about taxation as theft in fiction. Well, this reinforces a very specific libertarian fantasy, that the private sector is efficient and moral, while the public sector is greedy and incompetent. By cheering for Stark to keep his tech, we are cheering for the privatization of national security. We are cheering for the idea that a single individual has the right to decide how powerful technology is used simply because he invented it or paid for it. It subtly trains us to view taxation as an infringement on greatness. If the government taxed Bruce Wayne properly, maybe Gotham could afford a better police force, better mental health services for all those Arkham inmates, and better street lighting. Maybe they wouldn't need Batman. But that's a boring story, of course. Who would want to go to the theater and watch a story like this, or even read it? And I don't know, maybe you're just bored listening to me right now. My friends, let's face it, a story about a well-funded municipal mental health clinic doesn't sell tickets. But a story about a billionaire jumping off a roof does. So we accept the narrative that the best way to solve social problems is for the rich to throw scraps from their table rather than for the table to be reset. And of course, to make this idea even stronger, we need a strong distrust of institutions. To justify the existence of a vigilante, the system must be broken. If the police were competent, Batman would just be a weirdo in a costume interfering with an investigation. If the government were honest, Iron Man would be a dangerous rogue agent. So here comes the incompetent police and corrupt governments. So fiction writers have to stack the deck. In Gotham City, the police are either hopelessly corrupt or breathtakingly incompetent. Commissioner Gordon is usually the only honest cop in the entire city, which is statistically impossible, but narratively necessary. The politicians are always taking bribes from the mob. The judges are always letting criminals go on technicalities. Well, this creates a universe where the system is the enemy. It validates the cynic's view that government is useless. It tells the audience, see, you can't trust the law. The law protects the bad guys. True justice comes from outside the law. And here comes the vigilante solution. This is where it gets dangerous. When we constantly consume media that portrays institutions as failures, it erodes our faith in real-world institutions. We start to believe that red tape, which is often just due process and civil rights, is an obstacle to justice. We start to crave the vigilante solution. We see this spilling over into real-world discourse. When people cheer for extrajudicial punishments, or when they support leaders who promise to smash the system and ignore the courts, they are channeling that Batman energy. They want the quick fix. They want the strong man who ignores the rules because he knows what needs to be done. But in reality, due process exists for a reason. Technicalities are often rights designed to protect the innocent. A vigilante doesn't have a body camera. A vigilante doesn't have an oversight board. If Batman beats up the wrong guy, who do you complain to? Alfred? My friends, the superhero genre relies on the premise that the hero is infallible. We know Batman punched the right guy because the movie showed us he was the bad guy. But in the real world, vigilantes make mistakes. They have biases. They lack context. By idolizing the fictional version, we risk becoming tolerant of the real world version, which is far less noble and far more dangerous. So, should we stop watching superhero movies? Is that the point? Of course not. They are fun. They are emotional and they allow us to escape a complex world for a few hours. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the fantasy of a billionaire savior. I'm not saying that I'm against it, but we need to recognize it as a fantasy. We need to be critical of the worldview it smuggles in. We need to remember that in the real world, billionaires are not Tony Stark. They are not building suits to save the universe. They're building yachts to sail the Mediterranean. In the real world, a private citizen operating outside the law is not a hero. They are a threat. The Batman paradox is a reflection of our own impatience with democracy. It highlights our desire for easy answers and powerful saviors. But true heroism isn't about one rich guy fixing everything. True heroism is the boring, slow work of building a society that doesn't need a Batman in the first place. It's about funding the schools, fixing the potholes, and ensuring that justice isn't a privilege of the wealthy, but a right for everyone. We can love the Bat, but we shouldn't want to live in Gotham. And we certainly shouldn't wait for a Bruce Wayne to save us. We have to save ourselves. And unfortunately, that doesn't come with a cool cape. It comes with voting, organizing, and the hard work of being a citizen. Well, my friends, that's the article, but we're not done. Let's move on to the Focus on Language section. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Now, I hope you found this article thought-provoking, interesting, and I hope you learned something along the way. But now let's shift gears and talk about the language we used in this article. Now, one of the best things about analyzing pop culture through a political lens is that it gives us access to some incredibly sophisticated vocabulary that describes power, society, and human psychology. We aren't just talking about good guys versus bad guys anymore. We're talking about systems. I want to highlight 10 specific words and phrases we used, break them down, and show you how to use them to sound more articulate in your daily life. Now, first, let's look at the word oligarch. O-L-I-G-A-R-C-H, oligarch. An oligarch is a member of a small group of people who control a country or organization. Now, usually we use this to talk about Russian billionaires or corrupt regimes. But using it to describe Batman or Iron Man is a powerful rhetorical move. It strips away the hero label and focuses on their wealth and power. In real life, you can use this to describe any industry dominated by few rich players. For example, the tech industry is becoming an oligarchy. 3 companies control everything. It implies that money equals power, and that power is concentrated. So that's the first word, oligarch. Next, we have benevolent. B-E-N-E-V-O-L-E-N-T, benevolent. Now, we talked about the benevolent dictator. Now, benevolent means kind, well-meaning, and charitable. It's the opposite of malevolent. Now, we often use it to describe someone in power who is actually nice. For example, we can say, he was a benevolent boss. He always gave us Fridays off. But when we pair it with dictator, it creates an oxymoron, a contradiction. It questions whether someone with absolute power can truly be kind. So that's benevolent, my friends. Then we have impunity. I-M-P-U-N-I-T-Y. Well, this is a crucial word when talking about justice. Impunity means exemption from punishment or freedom from the injurious consequences of an action. If you do something with impunity, it means you do it without fear of getting caught or punished. In the article, we implied superheroes operate with impunity. In real life, you might say something like, people park in the bike lane with impunity because the police never write tickets. It expresses frustration that the rules don't apply to everyone. So that's impunity. Next, let's talk about vigilante. Vigilante, vigilante. A vigilante is a member of a self-appointed group of citizens who undertake law enforcement in their community without legal authority. Batman is the textbook definition. But in real life, being a vigilante is usually seen as dangerous. You might use this metaphorically at work. You can say, for example, we can't have vigilante coding. Everyone needs to follow the proper protocols and get their code reviewed. It means going rogue, even if you think you're helping. So that's vigilante. Next, we got archetype. Archetype, archetype. An archetype is a very typical example of a certain person or thing, like a recurring symbol or motif in literature. The hero, the villain, the wise old man, these are all archetypes. Now, we call the billionaire hero an archetype, but you can use this to analyze people or stories. For example, we can say he fits the archetype of the absent-minded professor perfectly. Well, this word is a sophisticated way to say stereotype or model. So that's archetype, my friends. Next, we have redistribution. 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 Well, this refers to the transfer of income and wealth, including physical property, from some individuals to others by means of a social mechanism such as taxation. We contrasted philanthropy with redistribution. Using this word shows you understand economics. For example, the debate isn't just about growth. It's about the redistribution of resources. Well, if you use this word, it sounds much more academic than just saying sharing money. So that was redistribution. Next, we've got incompetence. Let's look at this word. Incompetence, incompetence. Well, incompetence means the inability to do something successfully. Now, we talked about the myth of government incompetence. Well, this is a great word for complaining professionally. Instead of saying, my team is stupid, you say, I'm frustrated by the sheer incompetence of this department. It attacks the skill level, not the person. But let me tell you, my friends, it's still very, very harsh. So use it wisely. So that's incompetence, my friends. Next, let's talk about the status quo. Status and quo, Quo. Well, this is Latin for the existing state of affairs. Now, superheroes often fight to protect the status quo. In business or politics, this is used constantly. For example, we can say, we can't just maintain the status quo. We need to innovate. It refers to keeping things exactly as they are. Maintain the status quo. Well, sometimes it's good, sometimes that's what you want, and sometimes it's bad. You need to innovate, like in this example. So that's status quo, my friends. Next, let's talk about nuance. Well, you might have noticed by now that not all the words I used literally in the article, but all these words are related to the context of the article, whether we use them literally or not. And that's very important. That's how you can learn new words every day, not only from English Plus Podcast, but from any source where you read and listen to English. But anyway, let's focus on nuance. Nuance is a subtle difference in or shade of meaning, expression, or sound. Now, we want to look at the nuance of the Batman story. In arguments, this is your best friend. For example, you can say, you're ignoring the nuance of the situation. It's not just black and white. My friends, this word makes you sound reasonable and deep. So use it. But use it properly, of course. So that's nuance. Finally, let's touch on agency. Agency, agency. In sociology and philosophy, agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. That's agency. We said superhero movies strip citizens of their agency. If you feel like you have no control over your life, you lack agency. For example, I left that job because I felt I had no agency. I was just following orders. All right? These are the words that I wanted to share with you. Remember, in context, that's the best way to learn. And that's not something you're going to find only in this article. You're going to find it in all our articles on the website. So please just go there. Do yourselves a favor. Go there and take your knowledge and English to the next level. Now, of course, I want you to go there because it's my website, obviously, but it's a win-win. Trust me. And of course, you can always pick and choose the topics you are interested most about. But anyway, we're not done. Still have the speaking section and the critical thinking section. So now, before we move to the critical thinking section, let's take these words and put them into action. I want to talk about a specific speaking technique we used a lot in the article. The rhetorical question. Did you notice how many questions I asked in the text? Why is this archetype so appealing? Does this narrative train us to distrust democracy? I didn't expect you to answer them out loud. I asked them to guide your thinking. In speaking, rhetorical questions are a weapon. They engage the listener. They force the listener to mentally agree with you before you've even made your point. If I say traffic is bad, well, that's a statement. And to be honest, it's boring. But if I say, why do we accept that sitting in traffic for 2 hours is normal? Now I have your attention. I'm challenging the status quo. And this is obviously a rhetorical question. I'm not waiting for an answer. So here's your challenge, my friends. I want you to think of a problem in your life or your city. Maybe it's the price of coffee, the noise, or a bad boss. I don't know. You choose. I want you to formulate 3 rhetorical questions using 3 of the vocabulary words we just learned. For example, if you're annoyed by your boss who micromanages but knows nothing, you might ask, why do we reward incompetence with high salaries? Does he think he can rule the office with impunity just because he's the manager? Is this really leadership, or is it just the archetype of a bad boss? See how that works? It elevates your complaining into a philosophical critique. So try it out in front of a mirror or record yourself. It makes your English sound much more persuasive and much more dramatic. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, this is a speaking challenge. Can we reach out? Can you send this challenge to me and ask for my opinion? Of course you can. But you can only do this on my Patreon page. And when I say Patreon, don't freak out. I'm not asking everyone to go there, subscribe, and pay money. Of course you can do that. That's one of the main ways I fund this whole project, but you don't have to. You can go to Patreon and become a free subscriber. You can subscribe for free there, and you will have better access to me, and you can send me all these things. You can send me all these challenges, and we'll talk about it. Just a thought. But now, my friends, it's time for us to put on our critical thinking caps. And you might be thinking, what the hell? We just talked about this, that sounded persuasive. Actually, this is exactly what you should be doing with everything in your life. I truly believe that critical thinking is the superpower of the future. It's not just to be skeptical about everything. That's not the point. The point is to challenge everything. Even the most persuasive things you ever say, especially the most persuasive things you ever say. So that's what we're going to do next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Okay, my friends, let's take a breath. We have spent a lot of time deconstructing the superhero myth, calling it anti-democratic, elitist, and essentially a propaganda tool for oligarchs. And while those arguments are valid, if we stop there, we are being intellectually lazy. We are ignoring the other side of the coin. To be truly critical thinkers, we have to play the devil's advocate and defend the very thing we just critiqued. Is it possible that the Batman paradox isn't actually a paradox, but a necessary function of storytelling? Now, first, let's challenge the idea that these movies make us passive or anti-democratic. Literature has always focused on the exceptional individual. From Gilgamesh to Achilles to King Arthur, stories are rarely about a committee solving a problem through a series of votes. Why? Well, because that is boring. Drama requires conflict, and conflict requires a protagonist with the agency to act. When we watch Batman, Are we really thinking, I wish a billionaire would save me? Or are we engaging with a metaphor for personal responsibility? The core of the Spider Man ethos, with great power comes great responsibility, is actually a deeply moral, pro social message. It doesn't matter if the power is money, like in Batman, or spiderweb, like with Peter Parker. The message is that if you can help, you must help. Well, this encourages the viewer to look at their own capacity, however small, and ask, what can I do? It's not necessarily about waiting for a savior, it's about being inspired to be capable. Furthermore, let's look at the distrust of institutions argument. In the article, we claim that portraying the government as incompetent is dangerous. But isn't it also realistic? Now, art reflects life. If Gotham's police are corrupt, it's because the writers are observing the real world where corruption exists. To demand that fiction always portray the government as effective and just would be its own form of propaganda, state propaganda. In fact, the vigilante narrative can be seen as a crucial check on power. When the system fails, when the law protects the rich or the corrupt, the vigilante archetype represents the moral conscience of society. It is the idea that justice is separate from the law. Sometimes laws are unjust. Sometimes institutions are oppressive. The hero who operates outside the law isn't always an oligarch crushing the poor. Sometimes they are the only force protecting the vulnerable from the state. Think of Robin Hood. He was a criminal. He was a vigilante. But he is a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Is Batman really so different just because he lives in a manor instead of a forest? And finally, let's touch on the benevolent dictator fantasy. Yes, in reality, it is dangerous. But in fiction, it serves a psychological need, the need for order in a chaotic world. We live in a time of massive uncertainty. We don't know if the planet will be habitable in 50 years. We don't know if the economy will collapse. The superhero movie is a modern fairy tale. It provides a temporary resolution to unresolvable anxieties. To strip that away, to demand that our escapism be perfectly aligned with democratic theory, is to deny the human need for myth. Well, maybe the problem isn't the movies. Maybe the problem is that we have lost the ability to distinguish between myth and reality. We can enjoy the myth of the benevolent king on Saturday night and still vote for the boring, bureaucratic city council on Tuesday morning. I believe the human mind is more than capable of holding those two conflicting ideas at once, isn't it? You see what we've done here, my friends? It's a very simple exercise to challenge the very things you said. Say something you believe in and then challenge it for just a couple of minutes. And try to come up with counter arguments, not to confuse yourself or confuse other people, not at all, but to see the thing from many different perspectives. Because it is usually the case with everything we have. I mean, it's rarely the case that we can see something from one perspective and that's the only perspective you can see something from. Usually there are many perspectives. There are a lot of sides we can't see if we don't take a step further than our own position and try to see it from that perspective or from that angle. So this exercise, and we have it in all our articles on English Plus Podcast, especially the new ones, encourages us to challenge our own thoughts before we start challenging other people's thoughts and just criticize people. We should start with ourselves. If you ask me, this is a very healthy exercise to become better thinkers and to have better arguments. And with that, we come to the final section of this article and this episode, obviously, and I'm going to leave you with 5 questions to discuss. Let me start with the first question. Is with great power comes great responsibility actually a dangerous idea? We usually accept this as a good moral, but does it imply that only those with power matter? Does it suggest that if you don't have great power, you don't have responsibility? I want you to discuss the difference between the responsibility of the elite versus the responsibility of the common citizen. Now, my second question. If Batman existed in the real world, would you support him or want him arrested? Now, I want you to move past the cool factor. Imagine a masked man is breaking bones in your neighborhood tonight. He says he's targeting criminals, but he has no oversight. Do you feel safer? Or do you feel like you're living in a war zone? Where is the line between a hero and a terrorist? My next question: can a billionaire ever truly be a man of the people? Now, we see politicians and fictional characters try to bridge this gap. But is the life experience of an oligarch so fundamentally different that they cannot possibly understand or represent the needs of the working class? Is empathy enough to bridge the wealth gap? And the next question: does fiction shape our politics, or does politics shape our fiction? Do you love Batman because we are already frustrated with democracy? Or are we frustrated with democracy because we grew up watching Batman? I mean, which came first and which affects the other more? And my final question: is there a way to write a superhero story that represents democracy? What would that look like? Would Iron Man have to testify before Congress every time he wants to launch a missile? Would that destroy the genre? Try to brainstorm a plot where the system works and the hero is still cool. Who knows? It might work. You might start a new genre yourself. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's episode, my friends. But let me tell you, that's not the end of the article. Of course, I'm going to skip the next part. And this one is the coolest part of the article. And I've started adding this part recently to all our articles on English Plus magazine. And this one is the fantasy guest section. Now, for example, the fantastic guest for this episode is Andrew Carnegie, the author of The Gospel of Wealth. You don't want to miss this interview. Of course, it's a fantasy interview. It's not a real interview, but it's very useful to tie some loose ends and to take a different look at this topic that we talked about. Well, you can find this on my website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. But we will have to bring this episode to an end, and I would like to thank you very much for your good listening. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, that's simply great. If you really want to take your knowledge and English to the next level, you have to do something about it. Answer the questions. Take this speaking challenge we talked about and do it. I told you how you can reach out to me if you want, but it doesn't matter if you have someone to tell you if it's good or not. The most important thing is that you should try it yourself, and you will definitely get better. Talk about this topic. Think about those questions. Even if to yourself in the mirror, that's fine. Just talking about this will get your knowledge and English to the next level. Again, thank you very much for listening, my friends. I'm Danny, and this is English Plus Podcast, a new episode after some time of no episodes, so I'm sorry about that. But I've been facing a lot of technical issues recently, and I'm changing servers and all that. But anyway, that shouldn't be a concern anymore. We're back on track. We're going to have more episodes in the days to come. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned because we have a lot to talk about in this theme: corruption and oligarchy. I'll see you next time.